I think I was shooting that one.
Yeah.
A little longer.
My friend, buddy.
Anybody want to sign?
Yeah.
I live for this. He goes, "This is my chance to be a little boy again."
Yeah.
I go, "You can play this stuff all the time." He goes, "Yeah, but they can come out really quick."
Or no, actually, my girl was going to sign the whole lot. All right, we're going to get started, everyone. Hello, thank you for coming. My name is Renee Vogelsang. I live here in Syracuse, and I'm speaking today on behalf of New Yorkers Against Fracking. We're a coalition of over 230 organizations across New York State, over 1,000 businesses, and hundreds of faith-based leaders against fracking and calling for a ban on fracking in New York State. We're here today to demand that Governor Cuomo and the Department of Environmental Conservation withdraw the proposed liquefied natural gas regulations. The proposed regulations go well beyond the stated intent to allow for vehicle fueling stations. Instead, they are designed for the oil and gas industry to build out infrastructure for fracking across the state. Worse still, the regulations are woefully inadequate and put the health and well-being of New Yorkers at risk. As a little background to give you today, New York State put a moratorium on liquefied natural gas fueling stations in the 1970s after a horrible explosion at a liquefied natural gas facility in Staten Island killed 40 workers in 1973. In that instance, a liquefied natural gas tank blew up. The scale of the explosion was horrific. A firefighter at the scene reported that it was, quote, like a science fiction novel or Dante's Inferno. Now, Governor Cuomo and the DEC have proposed new regulations for liquefied natural gas storage and transport with the stated intent to allow for small vehicle fueling stations. However, the regulations go far beyond this stated intent, offering no size limitations, no siting restrictions, unlimited transport, and permitting construction of conversion plants and export terminals. These regulations currently designed to allow for the unfettered transport and export to foreign markets of gas that is fracked in New York. The regulations also suffer from a wide array of shortcomings and gross inadequacies in safety and oversight. Essentially, they set the stage to support expanded natural gas development and fracking. Governor Cuomo and the DEC have gone far beyond what the law intends and have exceeded their statutory authority. They have also failed to put forth appropriate or anywhere close to adequate regulations to protect public safety. This appears to be a direct giveaway to the oil and gas industry. Governor Cuomo and the DEC have also failed to consider the science and ramifications of these regulations and expansion of liquefied natural gas. Indicative of the inherent problems with the proposed liquefied natural gas expansion, the prohibition would remain in New York City. If it's not safe or acceptable for New York City, how is it justified and safe for upstate New York? Governor Cuomo and the DEC have also failed to look at the associated environmental and public health impacts. The egregious nature of the regulations demonstrate why an environmental impact statement and public health assessment are absolutely necessary. Additionally, Governor Cuomo and the DEC have kept the Department of Transportation out of this process, which is dangerous and unacceptable considering the nature of the proposed expansion. It is also in violation of state law. It has become apparent that the DEC is attempting to pass rules that would have paved the way for fracking in New York under the guise of a less blatant edict. It behooves all of New Yorkers to be wary of the lie being told and investigate what these regulations would really allow the gas industry to do. For these reasons and many more, our next speakers will discuss. We demand that Governor Cuomo and the DEC withdraw these fatally flawed regulations and start over with a new rulemaking process that meets the stated intent of allowing natural gas vehicle fueling stations only. We are delivering a letter today to the DEC and Governor Cuomo that goes through these demands. A copy is included with the press release. With that, I'm pleased to introduce Keith Shue. He is a former engineer with experience in policy and regulatory review.
Thank you, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here today. In light of what we just heard about that disaster in 1973 that killed 40 people at an LNG plant in Staten Island, one might reasonably expect that if DC was ever to propose rules for permitting LNG facilities here in New York, that those rules would have to be the strongest, the most comprehensive regulations possible. To be absolutely sure that nothing like that, or perhaps something worse, would ever happen again. Well, think again. It's also noteworthy that that particular Staten Island tragedy could have been prevented, might have been prevented if only the powers that be had listened to the concerned residents in the area who knew how dangerous that facility was and who begged and pleaded to have that facility not constructed. In light of that history of ignoring people, one might think that if rules are promulgated, that this time DEC would go to the greatest lengths possible to engage the public, to hold public hearings around the state if necessary, to actively welcome input from people of all disciplines. Sadly, that hasn't happened. In fact, although DC has taken nearly 40 years to put these rules together, the department has given the public, the department has given us, only about 4 weeks to review them. I cannot think of anything more disrespectful to the 40 people who lost their lives in 1973, or the good people of Staten Island, New York City, who at that time tried to prevent that tragedy from occurring. I say I could not think of anything more disrespectful until I opened up the proposed rules themselves and saw that there was basically nothing there. I don't have time to get into all the many deficiencies of that document, which I hesitate to even call regulations, but I am going to discuss 3 things. First of all, Environmental Conservation Law, Article 23, Title 17. That is the enabling statute for these proposed regulations. And it contains some very specific language about what the rules need to address, what the content of those rules need to be. 231703 is titled Legislative Findings, and it states the purpose of the legislature is that liquefied natural gas facilities not be sited in residential areas or in dangerous proximity to contiguous populations. 231709, titled Criteria for Siting, specifically states the regulations for the siting of liquefied natural gas facilities shall, I repeat, shall take into account the density of population in areas neighboring the LNG facilities, the density of populations in areas neighboring delivery routes of LNG, the maximum distance that a liquefied natural gas vapor cloud is projected to expand and pose a threat to the public. So then the obvious question becomes, what is DEC saying about any of these things? Well, I've read these regulations up and down, and I don't see the word residential areas anywhere. I don't see the word population density or contiguous populations, unless you're talking about the game of smoke and mirrors that we're now having here from DEC. I don't see anything about vapor clouds either. So the question becomes, what do these rules say about siting? What do they say about how close an LNG facility can be next to a school, next to a playground, next to your village, your town, your city? What does it say about any of this stuff? Well, the answer is absolutely nothing. Because these proposed rules have neglected to include any meaningful siting criteria, they are not responsive to ECL Article 23, Title 17, and they don't satisfy the intent of the enabling legislation. Let me say something about sizing of facilities. One would think that if DEC puts forward proposed regulations out for public review, that there'd be some correlation between what they say the regulations are about and what the regulations actually are about. When you talk to DEC about these regs or read their press release, you'll hear a lot about gas stations. I mean, liquefied natural gas or truck fueling stations. And you might think, okay, well, that may not be so bad. That sounds like small potatoes. When you look at the rules themselves, you find something very different. The rules are not limited to permitting the authority of DC to small facilities. In fact, there's no restrictions at all in the regs on how large an LNG facility can be or how large it could become. If you read the regulatory impact statement for proposed rules, the picture the big picture is much different, and it becomes much more clear. Quoting from the regulatory impact statement, the type of facilities that could be permitted if these rules are promulgated include, and I quote, LNG import-export terminals, peak shaving plants that produce, store, and vaporize LNG, regional LNG production facilities, LNG production at natural gas wells. Natural gas wells, I thought we have a moratorium on fracking. LNG production at facilities with access to natural gas pipelines. So when you take into account the wide applicability of these rules to LNG facilities of any size, and you combine that with the total lack of any measurable siting criteria, you're left with the shocking reality that if these rules are promulgated, it would give DEC the latitude to locate an LNG facility of any size, of any type, anywhere in the state of New York. Could I say something about emissions? There's been a lot of talk about methane. There's been a lot of talk about methane, and we know that now that it's a potent greenhouse gas that can exceed the levels of potency of carbon dioxide for climate change. We also know that the production of frack gas in the real-world gas fields that are out there can leak up to 3 to 6%, and that cancels out any benefit that some people say there might be to natural gas from a climate perspective. But there's an interesting aspect of this that you may not know. LNG makes that even worse. It makes that even worse because in addition to the energy burning activities involved with turning gas into a liquid, putting it on trucks, putting it on ships, shipping it around the world, and then regasifying it, turning it back to gas on the other end, in addition to all the intensive energy burning activity associated with that, the simple process of storing LNG at cryogenic temperatures is leaky by design. In order to maintain a constant very low temperature of minus 259 degrees Fahrenheit, methane is periodically vented into the air, into the atmosphere. It's called auto-refrigeration, but what this means is that LNG, even when it is just sitting in a storage tank, is polluting the atmosphere and contributing to climate change. In addition to this, emissions are common in the process of converting LNG back to gas, which is why flare stacks, those things we're concerned about seeing at gas wells, that's why flare stacks are part of the landscape of regasification plants too. Finally, I'll say that, considering that Governor Cuomo has been outspoken about his interest in green initiatives to tackle the problem of climate change, we would expect that DEC would include some pretty strict requirements about this stuff in the rules to limit the chronic sources of intentional, not just fugitive emissions, but intentional emissions that happen at LNG facilities. Or maybe even require some special equipment to recapture that vented gas. But alas, just like these rules are silent on the subject of siting and size, they are completely silent on the subject of greenhouse gas emissions. DEC, Governor Cuomo, Commissioner Martins, New York State deserves better than that. Thank you.
Thank you, Chief. Our next speaker is Mary Menate. She's a nurse at Upstate Medical University, member of Shell Shock CNY, amongst many other community groups.
Thank you, Renee. And hello, everyone, and thank you for being here. So, deja vu. We gather again outside to protest the DEC's promotion of industrial gas extraction. Liquid natural gas storage involves precarious cryogenics, as Keith has just said, supercooled gas, and regular venting or flaring of vapors. I, as a nurse, searched the regulations looking for the studies and oversight mandates quantifying the impacts on climate change. Absent. I searched for the oversight mandates quantifying the health impacts on people living nearby. Absent. I looked for the studies on the cumulative environmental impacts of industrial gas extraction build-out, including storage, transport, and waste. Absent. I did, however, see multiple supporting references to a 2011 NYSERDA study supporting and justifying these regs, except it was not New York State Energy Research and Development Agency work. They hired out the study to a group called Expansion Energy, specialists in, quote, increased capacity for gas pipelines and storage, ultra-efficient gas-fired power plants, and the science of cryogenics. I am honored to stand here as a nurse and mother with an engineer, a social and environmental injustice advocate, and a scientist extraordinaire. And with you all, with deep and varied personal experience and backgrounds. Where are our concerns represented in these regulations? We are literally left standing outside while industry is inside writing the regs for business as usual. No surprise, but enough. We demand to be invited inside. We resent after the fact hustling to send written comments and condense our analyses into sound bites at a single public hearing. A just and open process requires much more time and complete environmental and health impact assessments, which would lead us directly to a square and unbiased look at the ultimate decision being no permits. Liquid natural gas storage, which promotes extreme fossil fuel extraction, is not worth the risks. And I'll end by saying over coffee this morning, I read about a small Baptist church in Texas that has become an incubator for grassroots organizing around the Keystone XL pipeline and way beyond. Reverend Kyle Childress explains, quote, "Giant corporations get a free ride. They can diminish people, destroy the earth, pour out climate-changing carbon, all in the interest of short-term profit." Being here today, we counter that with a call to justice. Quote, "Be a people who embody justice," says Reverend Childress, and serving and battling for justice is a long-haul kind of calling. So I thank everyone for coming today.
Thank you, Mary. Our next speaker is Dr. Sandra Steingraber. She's an internationally acclaimed author and biologist, distinguished scholar in residence at Ithaca College.
Thanks, Renee, and hi, everyone. What an honor to stand up here with a monarch butterfly. Reminds me why I'm here. I am a biologist. My field of study is public health. I'm, along with my colleague, Mary Menapace, whom you just heard from, I'm a member of the Concerned Health Professionals of New York. I want to begin today by emphasizing a distinction. Liquefied natural gas is not a form of compressed natural gas. Compressed natural gas is a vapor that's under pressure and it's sometimes used as a fuel, say, in municipal buses. By contrast, liquefied natural gas, LNG, is a whole different animal. It's created by extremely low temperatures, namely by supercooling methane to 259 degrees Fahrenheit, below zero. 259 below zero. So at that temperature, methane becomes a boiling liquid, and it must be maintained at exactly this temperature, minus 259 degrees, because that means it's kept right at the phase change between liquid and gas, right? Because insulation alone, just putting this thing in a giant thermos bottle, is not enough to keep that liquid a liquid. It's not enough to keep it cool. So you need evaporation as part of what Keith just explained as the auto-refrigeration process. It works like us when we sweat. The liquid in our blood plasma becomes beads of sweat on our skin, and that evaporates to a vapor to keep us cool in the heat. And I'm emphasizing this little physics detail here because there are two big ramifications. One for public health for us, and the other for the climate that we all depend on, including the monarchs. Okay, so as for public health, if we don't keep LNG exactly at the temperature that's necessary to maintain a boiling liquid, it will undergo a rapid phase change from liquid to gas, expanding in volume by 600 times. At that point, an LNG facility becomes a bomb, and it can take out an area with a flaming vapor cloud up to, depending on how large it is, a half a mile or more. So that's why an LNG truck overturned on a highway, even if it's not leaking, triggers mass evacuations, closing of highways that last all day long. Because this is a super cool liquid, you can't odorize the natural gas. So it has no odor. You can't tell with your nose if there's a leak. So you have to have methane detectors all around whenever you have natural gas. Well, if an overturned truck on the highway doesn't have a methane detector, then there's no other choice but simply evacuate the entire area. So a few years ago, when such a truck missed an on-ramp in Boston, closed down 2 freeways, shut the city down for the whole day, and had to evacuate a school, and there wasn't even a leak. That's just what you have to do to make sure that there's no leak. So why are there no limits on siting these facilities in our communities? Why are there no limits on putting these things next to schools, next to daycares, next to hospitals, next to airport? And what about these facilities as terrorist threats? There is nothing in the regulations that talk about any of those issues. So now let's talk about climate for a minute. LNG must be continuously vented to be safe for us. If you don't constantly leak methane into the air, it will turn into a bomb and blow us up. So we want it to leak. But what does that mean when it leaks? That means constantly we're sending methane, one of the most powerful greenhouse gases we know, into the atmosphere in order to keep us safe. That's what Keith meant when he said that these facilities leak methane by design. They have to, otherwise they're intensely dangerous. And in addition to these intentional leaks, just making LNG, getting it down to that temperature minus 259 degrees, means that we are using immense amounts of carbon-intensive energy in the cryogenic process. Thus, the carbon footprint of liquefied natural gas is at least 30% higher than conventional natural gas that's in vapor form. So how clean is LNG? Well, the best data we have suggests that it's roughly the same as coal. Roughly the same as coal. So what are we gaining by swapping out one fossil fuel for another with LNG? So to conclude here, DEC's liquefied natural gas regulations are a wolf in sheep's clothing. They profess to benefit our health and our environment. In fact, they pose a menace to both. They allow tanks full of an explosive boiling liquid to be located anywhere next to anything. They allow these tanks to vent potentially limitless amounts of methane without even a requirement to monitor those emissions, let alone limit them. I have to conclude that these regs are not regulations. They are a license to kill the climate. And it gives a lie to Governor Cuomo's pledge to lead on climate change. Governor Cuomo, we can do better than this. Let's withdraw these regs and start over. Thank you.
Thank you, Sandra. Our final speaker is Joe Heath. He's General Counsel for Onondaga Nation, also affiliated with many grassroots organizations in the region, also working on the 81 pipeline that's been proposed in central New York.
First of all, I'd like to thank all the concerned citizens that are here today. This should tell the governor and DEC how many people oppose what they're trying to do here. This is really an amazing turnout, and I really thank all of you. And I want to start with a reminder that we're standing on top of an industrial waste bed. This is part of the Allied Chemical Solvay Process Honeywell legacy to central New York. It's part of hundreds of acres of industrial waste right on the shores of this sacred lake. And we ought to learn some lessons from this mistake, because we're still paying for them here 100 years later. And the lessons are, don't pollute and make a mess. Because we always told later on, oh, it's really too expensive to clean it up. And it's much, much harder to clean a polluted lake or river after it's polluted than to keep it clean to begin with. So we're here today to remind the New York citizens that we're under constant attack from the oil and gas industry and the agencies. Even when we're holding off fracking, and we've held it off for 5.5 years due to the people's power that's exhibited here today, they're trying to lure us to sleep, trying to make us think we can be complacent. But we can't let our guard down, as exemplified by these new LNG regs and by dozens of frack-related infrastructure projects that are threats and attacks on our communities and our water bodies. These attacks come at us in 5 general ways. We're getting pipelines proposed and compressors, large storage of gas and propane underground and underneath the Finger Lakes, taking of our water from New York State and trucking it out so that it's forever lost. Last year alone, 100,000 tons of frack waste was dumped in New York State. And now they're putting together these large-scale storage and distribution centers. I'll give you 3 examples of this in a minute. But let's pause and reflect about why we are spending billions of dollars on fossil fuel infrastructure. This will only prolong our addiction to fossil fuels. And as Sandra just explained, switching from one fossil fuel to another is not acceptable. It's not morally responsible to the generations yet to come. We can't be fiddling while the planet roasts and burns, as evidenced by the sea level rise, the severe weather, and the native trees dying off. and the monarch not being able to find habitat. So, just a couple quick remarks about some local projects. I live down in northern Cortland County near 81 on some very nice glacial lakes. One lake. Right through the middle of those lakes, the Millennium Company is proposing to build a 24-inch, 1,200-pound gas pipeline, roughly from Binghamton to Syracuse. It's really only to connect two other large pipelines. It's about moving fracked Pennsylvania gas so that they can export it. They can export it in Massachusetts, where one of the owners of the pipeline is National Grid, a British corporation whose international business model is importing gas into England and Europe. Or they can move it to the west to Niagara Falls, where they can sell it to TransCanada, the promoters of the Keystone, because you need cheap fracked gas in order to exploit the tar sands. That's what this pipeline is about. It runs through some very critically environmentally sensitive areas. The lakes and the wetlands that surround them. It runs through the Tully gravel mine at the head of Onondaga Creek. It runs through the former salt mining facilities down there that help pollute this lake, which are totally unstable. It runs within a few hundred yards of Onondaga Middle School. Dozens of homes would be on top of it if they used that route. We are organizing to fight against that. People do not want that. There's also the citizens of Watkins Glen and Seneca Lake fighting massive storage of propane and gas underneath Seneca Lake in abandoned salt caverns. Two massive proposals over there. And just like these threats all over, the companies and the agencies never listen to local citizens. People have had to resort to civil disobedience over there. And the last project I want to talk about is this headline appeared in the Cortland paper about a month ago. Proposed propane facility in Preble. That's the town I live in. And what it did was announce a secret plan that the county IDIA was involved in. They were working with some developer to build a railroad spur in our town and build a massive propane distribution center. Nobody in the town was even asked or told. On Monday night, the town board took a step to begin to protect ourselves from that. So we are under constant attack from this industry. And we're at a crossroads in New York. It's time that Governor Cuomo lived up to his promises. New York could be the leader in sustainable energy. We do not need these regulations, and we do not need all of these infrastructure projects that will tie our children to this terrible habit that's ruining the planet. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe. We'll take any questions from the press. If there are any.
Was there any scoping process? Was there a scoping process for this?
Not that I'm aware of. Basically, there was the 2011 study that Mary referred to, which we now know was conducted by industry. And now we have these regulations. We have 4 weeks to look at them.
Well, that seems very irregular. Does this violate the State Administrative Procedure Act?
I'm not an attorney. I can't answer that one.
Yes.
Well, thank you all for coming.
I got another question.
Oh, sure.
From what I've been reading, the liquid natural gas technology, can be used for a lot of different things. It's, not just for the export, but it could also be used for like long-term storage of the gas. Is there an issue with a storage of the gas so that it can be stored and then sold when the prices are up? And does anybody have any thoughts or knowledge about that aspect?
Well, what we've learned over at Watkins Glen is that the reason they like solution salt caverns, and that's where you just flush the salt out from underneath the ground, is that you can move the gas in and out of there about 12 times a year, much more rapidly than the other methods of storing gas, which is either in aquifers or in abandoned gas wells. Those you can only move out 1 or 2 times a year. So the only purpose for storing in solution salt caverns, or the preferred purpose, is that you can move it when the price is high and put it back in there when the price is low. It's not about the large-scale storage that's necessitated by this being a seasonal commodity and it's produced 24/7. It's about corporate profits, moving it in and out. That's why they like solution salt caverns, which, by the way, there are on Tully Valley, and this new pipeline runs right over.
How is there a direct line between your fight to ban hydraulic fracturing, and natural gas extraction, with pipelines and storage of fuel for trucks?
Well, like we've all stated before, and other folks who are here can reiterate this, the regulations at hand go far beyond what they're saying their intent is with storage for fueling vehicles, which means there's no cap on the size of these storage facilities, and they could ultimately be used to import or export fracked gas. And so we see, and also these are woefully inadequate regulations, and so for many reasons, including that going beyond the scope of intent, being woefully inadequate regulations, this being a dangerous practice in general, with obviously the reason why LNG facilities were banned in New York State in the first place. This is why we're here today, to call on the DEC and Governor Cuomo to withdraw these regulations.
I can speak to that a little bit, the connection between fracking and pipelines and storage. Starting in 2015, because it's well known that venting gas into the atmosphere bioaccumulates in people, causes premature birth, cancer clusters, and other illness and disease. That's well known. U.S. EPA regulations are requiring the capture, no venting and flaring starting in 2015. They will not allow fracking of gas to be vented into the atmosphere. So it doesn't make any sense with liquid natural gas storage that's vented routinely into the atmosphere with no warning because there's no odor, and it doesn't make any sense to allow that when we're not going to allow, when fracking happens, the venting into the atmosphere because of the acknowledged health risks. And so that speaks to the pipelines. If you're going to drill a well, there's got to be a pipeline there to put the gas in immediately. So that's the alarm at this point. We're not allowing fracking, but we're allowing the infrastructure to start it on a dime when the moratorium, if the moratorium were ever lifted on fracking. So you can't separate the storage, the pipelines, and the drilling.
I just want to add one thing here. I think is the most important issue. The pipelines is a gateway for fracking. There's no question about that. And with the gas industry having 5 major exemptions in the United States, that should alarm everyone. The gas companies continue to say safe. If it's that safe, why do they have 5 major exemptions in the United States, period? I don't think we have to go any further than that. Thank you.
I wanted to ask, so I think the industry would say that using LNG can help replace diesel trucks that are on the road now.
Can't hear you.
What can you guys say to that?
Okay, so the question is about the replacement of LNG with diesel. Just in the way that with the fracking argument, the choice between fracked gas and coal is a kind of false choice because we have swapping out one fossil fuel for another doesn't really save us from climate calamity. We really need to embrace renewable energy. The choice between LNG and diesel is another false choice. So in the public statements that the DEC has released about these regs, it talks about the emissions benefits of tailpipe emissions benefits of LNG over diesel, and those are real. I mean, I've been writing about the health impacts of diesel exposure for a long time, and the diesel is nothing that you want to breathe in. It's carcinogenic, it's related to preterm birth and asthma and stroke risk and so on. On the other hand, it's not at all clear that looking at the whole life cycle of the LNG process that it's any cleaner because massive amounts of carbon fuel is required to just get the liquid, the L and the LNG, just to liquefy it, and that adds emissions into our air. Someone pointed out that you don't actually burn liquefied natural gas in its liquid form. It's super cold, and so before you actually combust it, It's regasified. When you regasify it, you actually have to have a flare stack to flare off other impurities in the gas. And that releases benzene, formaldehyde, all kinds of other hydrocarbons that are just as bad for us as diesel. So with a diesel tailpipe, you know, you can see the soot coming out and you know that's bad. With LNG, you've got the same kinds of emissions at many different points along the process. There's no evidence at all to suggest that LNG, from a life cycle perspective, is any better for us than diesel. And that points to the fact that these regs have been released without any science at all. There's no scientific basis at all, right? With the fracking regs, we all complain that the S-Guys was a 532-page, really bad piece of science. But we don't even have an S-Guys for these regs. It's completely science-free. So if the DEC is claiming that the whole life cycle of LNG is better for our respiratory health than diesel, then they need to make that case. My understanding as a biologist is that that's not the case at all.
Thanks. Mary, you mentioned in your remarks, please let us into this meeting. Have you been banned from this meeting?
Please. No, but we've been banned from the process.
Okay.
The only study that I could see that referenced justification for any of the writing of the regs was this NYSERDA study, which is on the DEC website. So I went to look at it. It wasn't NYSERDA. It was Expansion Energy. Go to their website and look. They are an energy. They deal in natural gas. That's their dealings. That's what they do, and that's the only study I could see citing these regs. But I just want to put a plug in. Mark Jacobson from Stanford and a bunch of his colleagues from Ithaca have done work on a wind, water, solar study, viable renewable energy for New York State. And as Mark Jacobson said last week, the science and the technology are there for a swift transition to renewable energy. What's standing in our way are social issues and political issues. And this is a shining example of politics and business getting in the way of the human health and well-being.
How come the 81 pipeline is a big FERC federal jurisdiction thing, and why is this, this is big infrastructure. I read that one of these LNG export facilities is like $10 billion. There's a lot of capital investment going, Why is this a state thing versus a federal thing?
Well, the export facilities are also a federal thing.
Right. And I did read in that study from Expansion Energy last night that the import and export LNG facilities are under the purview of FERC. However, local facilities, storage facilities, will fall, and it's accepted that every state that has LNG facilities has accepted that they fall under the control of local zoning. So we can, in our communities, say no to these facilities.
What's the difference between LNG and LPG?
Liquefied natural gas is methane, and methane, as it comes out of a wellhead, we call it natural gas, but actually it has quite a lot of other volatile hydrocarbons in it. But when you liquefy natural gas, you want to get rid of all those other hydrocarbons and only have methane. And so we take all the benzene out, for example, and again, that's also vented into the air. Benzene is a known carcinogen. So liquefied natural gas is pretty much pure methane. Liquefied petroleum gases refer to some of the other hydrocarbon gases that are also fracked out of the shale, including butane, ethane, and propane. And so what we see stored in the abandoned salt caverns under Seneca Lake is a combination of petroleum gases like propane and butane. Essentially, they're cigarette lighters under the earth, right? Put a cigarette lighter in a giant salt shaker, that's what you got under Seneca Lake. But in addition, Seneca Lake also wants to store methane, not in a liquefied form, but in a compressed natural gas form. So it's a lot of chemistry, but the important take-home message is it's all shale gas extracted products. Some of it's compressed, some of it's liquefied, but a lot of it, when it comes to liquefied natural gas, you can put it in long-haul trucks and use it as fuel. That's one thing you can do with it. But the main thing you do with LNG is put it in ships and send it across the ocean. You Google LNG and look at Wikipedia, that's what it will tell you LNG is for. So we're not fooled that we're going to be getting a couple of corner gas stations with these regs. That's the bait and switch. We walk into the store to buy a gas station and we end up with an LNG export terminal off of Long Island. That's because these regs are completely permissive.
I live in the town of Nelson on the border of the town of Georgetown. Last summer I was in my garden and heard this horrible roaring noise. Got in my car and followed it to one of these places where they have pipes. They were spewing flames 50 to 60 feet in the air. That went on for 24 hours, and that's how they vent. This has been happening since 1966. And there's also one of those facilities on the Orange-Delphi Road and Route 20 in the town of Manlius. So we're already being poisoned by these fumes.
And let's not forget, folks, where this is coming from. I live in northeastern Pennsylvania, 6th-generation landowner. When they frack, they ruin our water. 40 of my neighbors live with plastic water buffaloes. So we're going to take this back. We're going to liquefy it, right, and store it. Why are we going to store it? I thought this was America's fuel to be here. It's not. So we're tired of being poisoned in Pennsylvania, so the gas can be sent elsewhere to be utilized and then returned or turned over to a foreign entity, and we get the brunt of the contamination. So
we also get to compete price-wise when we want to buy
our
it.
focus here today is in the madness, from the drilling of the holes and ruining the water and the air where we live, to sending it and storing it here and impacting health in New York State and others, and then waiting till the price or the facilities are set up to send it elsewhere and then utilize it somewhere else. So our focus today is safety. We want the governor of New York and my governor, Corbett, to look at the safety issues on this. That's what we're asking for.
Thank you.
Well, we're in Pennsylvania.